For years, the story sold to South Africans was simple. Rhodesia was a brother state. White farmers, white soldiers, and a shared fear of Marxist guerrillas pouring across the Zambezi. Pretoria backed Salisbury with fuel, ammunition, police units, and cash. The two governments spoke the same language of siege and survival. Then, almost overnight, the brother was cut loose. Fuel stopped moving. Police units came home. And the man who had built his whole political career on white minority rule, Ian Smith, found himself alone at the negotiating table, forced to accept the very thing he'd sworn would never happen in 1,000 years. What actually happened between 1974 and 1980 is stranger and more cynical than the myth of betrayal that white Rhodesians told themselves afterwards. South Africa didn't abandon Rhodesia out of weakness, nor out of principle. It did it because keeping Rhodesia alive had become more dangerous to South Africa than letting it fall. This is the story of how a regional patron calculated, coldly, that its client had become a liability. Start with a fact that surprises people. South Africa and Rhodesia were never equal partners, and Pretoria never really trusted Salisbury's judgment. From the mid-1960s, when Rhodesia's white government declared independence from Britain rather than accept black majority rule, South Africa quietly propped the breakaway state up. South African police units served inside Rhodesia from 1967, officially fighting communist terrorism, unofficially keeping a friendly buffer state between South Africa and the newly independent black-ruled nations to the north. South African fuel kept Rhodesian trucks and fighter jets running through a UN oil embargo that should have strangled the country in months. South African banks and businesses gave the illusion of a functioning economy to a state that, on paper, the whole world had refused to recognize. But here's what the myth leaves out. South African Prime Minister John Vorster never believed Rhodesia could win its war outright, and he never believed white minority rule there was sustainable in the long run. Vorster was a pragmatist wrapped in the language of racial solidarity. He needed Rhodesia to survive just long enough to serve South Africa's interests, not to survive forever. Those interests were about geography and buying time, not blood loyalty to Ian Smith's project. Think about the map. Rhodesia sat directly between South Africa and the guerrilla training camps of Zambia and, after 1975, Mozambique. As long as Rhodesia held the line, black nationalist guerrillas fighting for Zimbabwean independence had to cross Rhodesian territory before they could even dream of reaching South Africa's own borders. Rhodesia was a shock absorber. Every year Smith's army held out was a year South Africa didn't have to fight that war on its own soil. That single strategic fact explains almost everything that followed. Support wasn't sentiment. It was insurance. And insurance policies get cancelled the moment the premium stops making sense. The turning point arrived with stunning speed in April 1974, when a group of junior officers in Lisbon overthrew Portugal's dictatorship. Nobody in Pretoria or Salisbury had planned for this. Portugal had spent over a decade fighting to hold on to its African colonies, and its collapse meant Mozambique and Angola were suddenly heading toward independence under the Marxist liberation movements Frelimo and the MPLA. The buffer just got a lot smaller, and the timeline just got a lot shorter. This is the part most retellings skip past too quickly, and it's worth sitting with, because it's the real engine of everything that happened next. Vorster looked at the map after Portugal's collapse and saw South Africa's entire northern security architecture crumbling in real time. Mozambique's independence in June 1975 meant Rhodesia now had a second guerrilla front on its eastern border, in addition to the Zambian one in the north. Angola's independence that same year meant South Africa itself would soon share a live combat frontier with Cuban-backed forces, which is exactly what triggered South Africa's own invasion of Angola later in 1975, Operation Savannah. Vorster's strategic problem was no longer how do we help Rhodesia win? It became how do we stop the whole region from turning into a ring of hostile, Soviet-aligned states surrounding South Africa? And once you frame the question that way, Rhodesia stops looking like an asset. It starts looking like the thing attracting all the fire. There's a detail that captures this shift perfectly: Détente. In 1974 and 1975, Vorster began quietly reaching out to African leaders he'd spent his career treating as enemies, most notably Zambia's President Kenneth Kaunda. The idea was audacious for a national party leader: trade Rhodesian concessions for regional stability. If Smith could be pushed towards some kind of settlement with black nationalist leaders, Vorster reasoned, South Africa could de-escalate its northern frontier without giving up anything at home. Rhodesia, in other words, became a bargaining chip in a much bigger game that had nothing to do with saving white rule in Salisbury and everything to do with protecting Pretoria. Smith didn't grasp this fast enough, or perhaps didn't want to. When Vorster summoned Rhodesian and Zambian-aligned nationalist leaders to a railway carriage on the Victoria Falls Bridge in August 1975, for talks literally staged on the border between the two countries, it should have been a wake-up call. It wasn't. The talks collapsed. Smith went back to fighting a war he could not win on his own, still assuming South African backing was permanent. It wasn't. It never had been. It was conditional the entire time, and the condition was about to expire. The mechanism was never a dramatic public break. There was no press conference announcing the end of the alliance. Instead, South Africa applied pressure through the two things Rhodesia depended on most: fuel and firepower, both of which flowed through South African territory and South African goodwill. In early 1976, Vorster ordered a partial withdrawal of South African police units from Rhodesia. Roughly 2,000 men, helicopter crews included, quietly came home. Officially, this was framed as normal rotation. In reality, it removed a critical layer of manpower and air support Rhodesia's own tiny military could not replace. The Rhodesian security forces were already stretched thin, fighting a two-front guerrilla war with a white population of barely 250,000. Losing South African helicopter crews wasn't symbolic. It directly reduced Rhodesia's ability to move troops fast enough to counter guerrilla incursions. Then came the fuel. Rhodesia's oil, in defiance of the international embargo, moved by rail and road through South Africa, refined and shipped by South African companies operating with Pretoria's quiet blessing. In 1976, as American diplomacy intensified, South Africa began restricting that flow. It was never a full shutoff, because a full shutoff would have collapsed the Rhodesian economy overnight and handed Pretoria's fingerprints to the world. Instead, it was throttling, enough friction to make Smith feel the walls closing in, not so much that Rhodesia collapsed before Vorster had extracted a settlement. This is the genuinely underappreciated part of the story. South Africa wasn't trying to lose Rhodesia the war. It was trying to force Rhodesia to the table before the war destroyed it entirely, because a negotiated, managed transition in Rhodesia was far less frightening to Pretoria than a guerrilla military victory that would embolden South Africa's own liberation movements. A humiliating collapse next door was the outcome Vorster feared most. Controlled surrender was the outcome he was engineering. American pressure gave Vorster the perfect cover for what he already wanted to do. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, worried about Soviet and Cuban gains across southern Africa after Angola, launched a shuttle diplomacy effort in 1976 explicitly built around using South African leverage over Rhodesia. Kissinger flew to Pretoria and told Vorster plainly that continued support for Smith's government would cost South Africa international standing and American goodwill at a moment when Pretoria desperately needed both, given its own escalating isolation over apartheid. Vorster didn't need much convincing. Kissinger was handing him a script for a decision he had already reached on his own terms. In September 1976, under direct South African pressure, Smith went on Rhodesian television and announced acceptance, in principle, of eventual majority rule. For a man who had built his entire political identity on the phrase "not in 1,000 years," it was a stunning capitulation, and everyone in Rhodesia knew exactly who had forced his hand. It wasn't the guerrillas in the bush, not directly. It was Pretoria, turning off the tap. What followed was 3 more years of grinding, brutal war, because agreeing to majority rule in principle and actually negotiating its terms were two very different things. Smith tried every delaying tactic available, including a doomed internal settlement in 1978 that installed Bishop Abel Muzorewa as a nominally black prime minister while leaving white control of the security forces and courts intact. Nobody serious, inside or outside Rhodesia, believed this settlement would end the war, and it didn't. The guerrilla armies fighting under Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo rejected it outright because it changed the face of the government without changing who actually held power. Throughout this period, South Africa kept squeezing. Fuel supplies stayed restricted. Military support stayed capped. Vorster, and after 1978 his successor P.W. Botha, made it increasingly clear that Rhodesia's survival was not worth the price of South Africa's own international position, especially as evidence mounted that Rhodesia's white population was shrinking through emigration and its economy was hemorrhaging under the weight of prolonged war and sanctions. Continuing to bankroll a losing cause offered Pretoria nothing but the risk of being dragged down alongside it. The final act played out in London in late 1979, at the Lancaster House talks that finally ended the war and produced the internationally recognized state of Zimbabwe, with elections that brought Mugabe to power in 1980. South Africa's fingerprints were all over the outcome, not through direct participation at the table but through years of pressure that had made continued resistance economically impossible for Smith's government. Pretoria had gotten almost exactly what it wanted, a negotiated end to a costly, embarrassing war on its border, managed enough that South Africa avoided direct blame for the specific terms of Rhodesia's collapse.